Hi, everyone. Okay, so when I was a kid, to celebrate Halloween, as they so often do, my teacher had us draw jack-o'-lanterns. And everyone was doing it, and I was doing it, and we were all having a grand old time, except my teacher noticed something. My jack-o'-lantern was really sad. So the school called my mom, had her come over, and my teacher had a very long conversation with my mother about how clearly me drawing this jack-o'-lantern like this wasn't just an artistic decision, but clearly me trying to include my own inner sorrow in the only way I knew how, through the pest fruit. And my mom waited very patiently for the teacher to finish before finally, for the first time, turning to me and asking, "Why did you draw the pumpkin as sad?" And I looked her straight in the eye and I said, "Well, you would be sad too if somebody stabbed a knife into your brain." Yeah, so she still has the thing, by the way, I'm gonna inherit it. So this would be a prime example of a communication issue. My teacher thought I was trying to express some inner turmoil, when in actuality, I just thought being a jack-o'-lantern kind of sucked. Communication issues are always going to happen, at least until humans can communicate telepathically, which, contrary to what superhero cartoons led me to believe, isn't going to happen, probably. See, there's this really cool thing where every person in the world has a slightly different understanding of what words there are, how you pronounce those words, and what those words mean. When enough people have this slightly different understanding, we would call that a dialect or a language. When you think of dialects, you probably think of regional ones, like Southerner or British or New Yorker, but in reality, any group that communicates a lot with itself can create its own dialect. A good example you might be aware of is the Gen Z dialect. I cannot, nor will I ever, be able to explain to my grandmother the proper connotations of the word yeet. So another group with its own dialect that you might be aware of is autistic people. And in order to go over that, I'm actually going to be referencing the DSM-5. So first things first, deficit in nonverbal communication. So there's this thing neurotypical people like to do where they like to put a lot of meaning into how they move their hands and their face and their eyes. Kind of like how bees communicate through dance, neurotypicals communicate through bee dances. And you can take like an autistic or a neurotypical baby and they just kind of pop out of the womb with a pre-programmed understanding of the bee dances. Like you can frown at a baby and it will start crying. But autistic people have to learn the bee dances. And as such, they're probably not going to get it until at least the stage in human development where they understand that square pegs go in square holes. Another thing that autistic people do is refuse to make eye contact. Which, duh, because if you don't understand the bee dances, there's absolutely no reason to be looking at someone's face. No information is being expressed. There's a whole room full of other interesting informations, and doors, and windows, and bright, colorful objects. Okay, you know what? Actually, let's do an experiment. Everybody, look at your shoes. Okay, keep looking. That was not as loud. Okay, that was supposed to be really loud. Yeah, if you looked up, you would not make eye contact without understanding the bee dances. Another thing people with autism do is difficulty adjusting behaviors to fit various social contexts, otherwise known as sincerity. Autistic people will treat you basically the same, regardless of if you're a CEO or a janitor, whether or not people are watching. Because of this, when neurotypical people act wildly different depending on the context or depending on the situation, it seems really weird and kind of manipulative. Even in situations where acting differently is a necessary social politeness, it can still seem really strange and kind of freak you out a bit. Highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus, otherwise known as liking stuff a lot. Neurotypical people will legitimately say something is their favorite thing they've ever seen in the entire world and will have only seen it twice. From the autistic perspective, when you like something, you talk about it a lot because every time you talk about it, the happiness button in your brains gets pressed. So you're going to keep pressing it until somebody asks you to stop. So here's the thing. Just because people speak a different dialect doesn't mean they can't learn or understand a new one. I mean, no one in this room was born speaking English, but you're understanding it right now. When an autistic person tries to speak and act like a neurotypical one, that is called masking. Masking can include stuff like making eye contact, translating the bee dances, not going on unprompted rants about things that bring you joy, and translating a lot of neurotypical behaviors into neurotypical context. Changing the way you act and behave in order to make people around you more comfortable is something I think is just kind of a basic courtesy. I mean, at least to a point. We do live in a society. You have to do things for other people. You have to wear pants. But here's my problem. I think that some people have a habit of assuming that their way of communication is the only right way to communicate, and that if somebody misunderstands them, the other person is wrong, and that if they misunderstand someone, the other person is wrong, and that everyone in the world should do everything they can to speak and act the way they do, but they shouldn't have to do anything to speak and act like someone else. Do you guys think that's fair? No, right? And I wrote that into the script, assuming you would agree with me, because I really loaded that question. The speech was done through the context of autistic communication with people who are not autistic, because that happens to be the communication difference I'm most familiar with. But as it turns out, there are a whole bunch of people with different methods of communication that are seen as invalid by the mean, smelly jerks we talked about earlier. As the world becomes smaller, being able to speak with someone who speaks differently than you isn't just a plus, but a requirement. My mother always told me that when talking to someone from another culture, at least one of you is going to be uncomfortable, and you better make sure that you're the one who's uncomfortable. There's always going to be errors and miscommunications, but if we learn to ask rather than just assuming we already know, I think we're going to be better off than if we didn't try. Thank you.